This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoy this critical thought, your daily discussion on game design. And be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and you can pitch future critical thought topics. Alright everybody, for today's critical thought, we're returning back to the topic of teaching or educating someone how to play through a video game. And part of this is going to echo our previous discussion regarding organic level design or organic tutorial design, in the sense that levels can be designed in a way to passively teach someone without stopping for a cutscene or a dialogue box, stuff like that. A very simple example of this would be, let's say in the very first scene of a platformer, the player runs into an obstacle that's like this tall, and this just so happens to be just below the maximum that the player can jump. So by the player jumping over this obstacle, they instinctively will now know that if ever they see an obstacle or a barrier that tall, or less than that they can jump over that no problem. It also teaches them how to jump. So, with that said, one of the challenges when we last spoke about organic tutorial design was the fact that it mainly fits in games built on action. Be it a platformer, a game like Portal, even something like Soulsborne, for instance. It's pretty much about how the level and enemy designs are built into the environment to test the player. With enemy designs, for instance, one of the classic forms of design we see in action titles is whenever a new enemy is introduced, they will always attack the player solo. They will never be part of a crowd of other enemies. There will never be more than one of them. There's always going to be just one. And the point of that is to give the player a chance to see this new enemy and scope them out without interference from anything else. Once a player masters that, then that enemy can be integrated into other groups. They could spawn 2 or 3 of them at a time. They basically become a normal part of the routine going forward. But that first encounter is key to educating the player on what to expect. But like I said, when it comes to games that aren't built on action, strategy titles, turn-based strategy, 4X, stuff like that, organic level design or organic tutorial design doesn't work all that well. We've talked about this many times in the past, and one of the big reasons, I'm trying to get myself centered there, one of the big reasons is that you can't separate game mechanics and systems and expect the player to learn how things work. One of the biggest problems when it comes to tutorials in turn-based strategy or 4X strategy games is that you can't really teach someone how to run an empire when you're taking each individual system and isolating it from everything else. Anyone who's played a grand strategy game like Total War or Europa Universalis and so on knows that these systems don't operate in a microcosm. Everything is connected and everything will impact everything else. And because of that, if you try and teach something separate, it's not teaching them how these systems work in accordance with each other and how the game is meant to be played. And there's certainly room for a bigger talk about designing effective tutorials in abstracted-based titles. But for today's critical thought, I won't focus on little things that you can do. These are little cues or UI tips that can make a game easier to learn or easier to process, and it doesn't require a massive redesign of your game. And this one makes this very fascinating to talk about, because the examples we're going to bring up and some of the things that I've thought of, these are things that should barely register to you as either a player or a designer. But you never know when something even as insignificant as a font change or making a number bigger or smaller can impact making it easier to learn your title. And a major reference for this, and one that I always like to go back to when we talk about making a game accessible to learn, is Plants vs. Zombies. I know I did a video on that, I think last year, but I really need to add that to the Dissecting Design routine or schedule, because it is a very fascinating game to learn and to understand what PopCap did right. Honestly, I think it's their best game they've ever made, although I'm sure we could have some arguments about Plants vs. Zombies versus Peggle. And one of the things Plants vs. Zombies does at a master level is how well it makes it easy to learn. Again, if you haven't seen yet, in 2011, designer George Tan gave a GDC talk about designing Plants vs. Zombies. Very fascinating watch, if you can find it. I'm not sure if it's on the GDC Vault. I'm sorry, GDC Vault. There you go. But definitely take a look at that. But what he talked about was all the little subtle cues and changes to the UI and design that he and the rest of the team did to make the game as accessible as possible. And this is one of the hallmarks of some of like the best, I guess, quote-unquote casual games out there. Again, the stuff from PopCap, Regency Solitaire. I'm sure there are even more examples, but those are the only two that come to mind. And I have a little bit of example I want to show you. There you go. So this is the screenshot for Plants vs. Zombies. Now, when you start the game, you always start with two items. You have the pea shooter that costs 100 sunlight, and the sunflower, which costs 50. And when you start playing Plants vs. Zombies, you start with 50 sun. Now, what I just described to you, it sounds like none of that should really matter. It just sounds like, we put the elements in, we give the player starting resources, 1, 2, 3, we're done. But what George talked about in this talk was how this took some time to iterate and refine. And this is where we can really talk about these subtle little things that can make your game easier to learn. And when we talk about this, it's important to mention we are talking about from a new player's perspective. Someone who hasn't spent 50, 100 hours on your game. Someone who may not even know what the genre is and may have just picked it up due to high reviews. So the example is, when they were going around the game, anyone who's played Plants vs. Zombies knows that the absolute first thing that you do whenever possible is you start building sunflowers, because they produce resources, and the more resources you have, the more you can build. The more you can build, the better you can defend your lawn. So when it began, they started the player out with 100 sunflowers, or 100 solar energy. That's the 650 in the upper left. And they ran into a problem with that, because if you start with 100, you're going to naturally build the pea shooter, because 100 is the same as that. The problem, though, is then you're basically stalling your economy. So they thought, okay, how can we train, or how can we reinforce to start building sunflowers? So what they did was they lowered it down to 50 starting. And what they did, and what this basically clued into the player was, well, I start with 50. The first thing that I can build is cost 50. Maybe I should build the sunflower. And by the time the player, and in terms of charging things up, by the time the player gets 50 solar back, the sunflower should be fully charged again to immediately build a second one. And the reason is, when you're starting out playing the game, the general idea is you want to have at least a minimum of 3 or 4 sunflowers producing solar energy. Again, this is to build your economy up. And it's kind of funny when we talk about Plants vs. Zombies like that, using like economy and min-maxing, because again, this is a casual game. But what happens, of course, is you build a 2 sunflower, and with the additional resources that you're getting, you should be able to easily afford the 100 for the pea shooter. But by then, of course, your economy should be off to the races and you're ready to go. Now again, that's an example of these little subtle things that can train the player to either focus on something or to start learning. And again, this is one of those weirdly weird concepts to talk about, because when you do this stuff right, it doesn't sound like you did anything at all. Again, if we go back to this example from Plants vs. Zombies, if you're just a regular player looking at the screen, or who's played the game, everything that I just described to you, you may not have even processed that while you were watching it. I know I didn't do that either. But when George, during his speech, he was talking about how he showed the different iterations of the game to his mother, and the things that she was getting hung up on, he was able to take those lessons and adjust the UI and the play to make it easier to learn. Now, with that said, there is a lot more we can talk about. I know in earlier Critical Thought we talked about symbolism in UI design. Again, it's easy to represent a health as, 3 hearts out of 5, versus, say, having someone look at you have 865 of your 1,532 points of health remaining. Symbols are an easy way to quickly grasp what something is, and again, it's easy to properly reference that. If I know I have 5 hearts out of my 10, I'm at 50% health. The same way as having a bar with only half the bar left, or again, 50 out of 100 points. Now, in terms of making things easy to learn, you have to understand about where the player's attention is going to be focused. Like, if we imagine this screen right here, right now, your eyes are probably focused, right here at my face. Well, that means if I have little things like over here or over there, chances are, unless I pointed them out or I made them completely opposite of everything else, you probably wouldn't notice them. So the first thing to keep in mind is, if something is important, it needs to be easily represented. If I'm playing a game where I have to keep track of my oxygen, for instance, having oxygen as like a little tiny number right there is not going to do a damn thing. So what would be a better option would be either making that number higher, or maybe having like a symbol that represents O2 that could start flashing when there's danger. Flashing and differences in the UI are a great way to cue the player into something important. One of my biggest nitpicks, especially among 4X and Grand Strategy titles, is you start the game for the first time, you hit start, the game loads up, and you're immediately assaulted by blinking UI elements here, 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 a text box in the middle, event logs, starting to scroll down over here. And again, how is a new player supposed to process what is happening? If you're going to do something like that, then try to introduce things one at a time. Even if it is the same thing as you need the player to do 5 different actions, show them one at a time to let the player know, okay, first I need to keep track of my economy, then I need to keep track of my happiness, then I need to do a research, then I need to pay attention to my units over here. And again, when it comes to properly showing things, you have to understand the order of relevance. Again, don't bother me with something like, my people want fancier looking cars when there's a food deficit going on at the same time. Likewise, if I'm trying to learn how, I used this example before, if I'm trying to learn how to drive a car, the first thing you shouldn't teach me is what the windshield wipers do. Being able to explain things in the order that they are important or when they're being used is very important in terms of teaching the player the mechanics or the schema of what it means to start learning their game. If I know that that X, Y, and Z are always important, then I should pay attention to X, Y, and Z. And you should build your tutorial around introducing X, Y, and Z first. Now, with that said, we're going to wrap up today's Critical Thought because, again, this is a very understated topic, and it's one that's very hard to properly explain. Because, again, if there's a good example of it, you won't know because you wouldn't have realized that it was one. So, for those of you watching, can you think of examples of games that passively taught you something without needing to reference a tutorial screen, a dialog box, stopping or interfering in the game in any way, but just simply in how it's presented or how the UI was designed, that it taught you what to do? And we'll be talking more about teaching the player probably in an upcoming Critical Thought. But with that said, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's Critical Thought, be sure to like and subscribe if you're new, and be sure to pitch your own critical thoughts if you have any suggestions. With that said, check back daily for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Till tomorrow, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.